Hey, this is Greg Kesich at the Press Herald, and I'm here with Bill Nemitz and City Hall reporter Randy Billings. Portland City Hall, I should say. Thank you for coming in, Randy.
Thanks for having us.
And there's a lot going on in Portland. The state government kind of shuts down in the summer, but city government does not. And you had a really busy meeting last week where a number of things got set for the November ballot, and I was hoping to just go through those with you and talk a little bit about them. One is the neighborhood zoning referendum, and could you explain that one a little bit and how that would work?
Absolutely. There was a group of residents who were upset about one zoning decision in particular out on Stroudwater neighborhood. The Camelot Farms, the city council rezoned that to allow a lot of new homes. And these residents wanted to push back against that, so they got some support throughout the rest of the city. And they put a question on the ballot that would really strengthen the neighborhood's voice in rezoning decisions. I mean, right now, a developer wants to rezone a piece of land. They ask the city, the planning board gives a recommendation, holds a public hearing, sends it to the council, council holds a public hearing, council votes, and that's the end of it unless they want to go to court. This referendum would allow abutters of a zone change within 500 feet to basically undo a zone change. If opponents could gather opposition of 25% of the people who live within that 500-foot radius, they could stop the zone change, and then the developer would have 45 days to try to get support of a majority of residents within 1,000 feet of that zone change.
So if 4 people live within 500 feet, you just need one person to say no?
This is true, yes.
Yeah.
I'm going to invest in tape measures.
Yeah, I mean, this seems very difficult to imagine how you would enforce this, because I think you would end up with whoever the abutters would get to sit down at the table with the developers and work out the deal, that they want.
Yeah, and it came up at the public hearing last week that, there seems to be even ambiguity about like how this would be measured. Would you take, if it was a 30-acre plot, would you drop a right in the middle of the land and then measure that 500 feet? Would you go to each corner? Would you take one driveway? So, there may be some details missing in it.
Sounds like, what this sounds like is kind of the codification of NIMBY, really, is that if it's in my immediate neighborhood now, I can stop it. And then, good luck. You can go out and try to override what I'm doing. But it's interesting how the pendulum has swung this way now to where it's not even something that people are embarrassed to admit. It's something that
and there's actually a group that is formed to oppose it, One Portland. And on the day that Give Neighborhoods a Voice filed their petition papers, they had a press release, and they basically called it Say No to the NIMBY Gated Community Referendum. So I think that's how it's going to be argued this fall.
It's interesting. It's one particular development. It sponsored this or sparked it. It's the turning Camelot Farms, this old dairy farm, into housing subdivision. It's inside the city limits. It's right near the turnpike. It's probably a good place to put a lot of housing, but some of the abutters don't like it. But interestingly, the first group to try to jump in line to take advantage of this, if it were to pass, is West End opponents to the cold storage plant, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it definitely generated out of the Camelot Farms, but I mean, people in Portland have been going through this for the last, 3, 4, 5 years now. Portland has an old zoning code. There's not many places to build. So in order to get new development, developers come in and they say, look, we could do this, but we need a little more height. We need a few more units. Yeah. And as Greg mentioned, no sooner had the public hearing ended, they put it on the ballot. The opponents on the west end of the Western Commercial, they got their petition papers. Now they're out there collecting signatures.
These are mostly residential people, correct?
Oh, yeah.
So how many of them live within 500 feet of where the cold storage thing would be?
Yeah, I have no idea. I haven't got my protractor out.
See what I mean? Again, the tape measure.
But it doesn't say how many people, right? It just says
it's a percentage.
Percentage, yeah.
It's a percentage.
So the guy who lives in a school bus across Commercial Street would qualify or whatever. It's amazing.
It is, and the cold storage thing was approved. This is a warehouse that is supposed to facilitate Portland's nascent cargo shipping.
Yeah, and
operation.
it's actually it's broader than that too. It like goes basically almost out to Veterans Memorial Bridge. I mean, Finn Sprague was there saying that it would
the zoning
affect him.
change.
The zoning change covered that whole area. So Finn Sprague,
Yeah.
Portland Yacht Services, he said, look, I'd love to be able to build a building tall enough that we could work on the Casco Bay Ferry Lines boats. And so I think those landowners out there all would like to take advantage of that.
Have you seen schematics as to what, we're talking about roughly about 20 feet difference, is that correct? 55 feet versus 75 feet?
Yeah, based on a certain number of conditions. Yeah.
So what would that do? Has anybody stepped back and said, okay, this is what this will do?
Yeah, there was some talk about it. It would be like, it would block the bridge, and then if you bring it down a little bit, you'd be able to see, underneath the bridge. But, throughout the process, the residents, they put a lot of pressure on city officials, and they actually got some, concessions out of like what you would actually need to do. So you couldn't just build this big block of a warehouse that's 75 feet tall. They made it so your building can only be so wide. You'd still need some corridors to the water. You'd need to meet some design guidelines. It couldn't just be this big block. So there were some concessions made on both sides of this, but apparently it wasn't enough for whomever the number of people are looking to undo it.
And there's an affordable housing referendum on the ballot as well.
They call it rent stabilization.
Rent stabilization, yes. And it's a limitation on rent increases for certain types of landlords, right?
Yes, and it's a lot more than that, I think landlords will tell you. So basically applies to individual landlords who own 6 or more units in the city. So it's not just large buildings. It's if you have, a 3-unit here and a 3-unit over there, and you don't live in either one of those, you're going to be affected by this. But what it would do is it would limit rent increases to the rate of inflation plus property taxes. But it would also establish a rent board. So I believe it's a 7-member board, and they recommend having 4 renters on the board. And what they would do is be able to grant landlords rent increases above what the CPI is, or consumer price index, and property tax. If, like, say, a landlord wanted to put a new roof on, you need to raise the rent to cover that. So he would have to go to the rent board after he's made the improvement into the building and say, look, this is what I invested. I need to raise my rent this way. And then the board would say, okay, yes, no.
Or no.
It would be after the fact? Or
it would be after the fact.
Yeah. So this is another question that came out from people gathering signatures and put it on the ballot, bypassing the regular city council process. We have elected officials. We have a mayor. What's going on? Why do people feel the need to go bring this stuff forward directly?
Well, they did. They had a 5-member housing committee. They looked at some of this stuff last year. The housing committee looked at rent control. Their city attorney said, well, this is legally problematic in the state, or at least it's unprecedented here. And then, at the end, Mayor Strimling came out with his own housing proposals, which included some sort of rent control limits on landlords coming in and, evicting a bunch of people to, improve the buildings. The housing committee said, well, we've had legal advice on legal advice that says, we really, shouldn't be doing this unless we want to get into some kind of legal fight over this. But there was some strong desire out in the community to see the rents being tackled. We did that no vacancy series, and which I believe was in
2 years ago.
2015.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and in the 5 years leading up to that, we saw some extraordinary rent growth. We put it at 40%. Even the landlord said, okay, yeah, you guys got that just about right. We got 38%. But they were saying at the public hearing last week that the rents have plateaued, if not are beginning to drop. That John Cully, he owns the Hiawatha, a brand new building where Joe's Smoke Shop used to be, and he said to get people in there, he's offering 1 to 2 free months of rent to attract people up there. So there's been a lot of new units coming on, and
market forces at work.
Some would say, absolutely.
But no, they don't go down, and they wouldn't go down under this either. This would just limit the increases.
Unless the market brought the rents down.
What about organization on each side of this? Is one side more organized than the other? Are the landlords, for example, going to be the people who brought the referendum? Obviously, are somewhat organized. What about the other side?
Yeah, landlords and apparently building contractors are organizing against this. So they formed a group called Say No to Rent Control. So I think you're going to see a lot of arguing this fall, the difference between rent control and rent stabilization. And I think the building contractors are getting involved at this point because they feel that landlords are going to be less willing to make the investments in their property if they don't know that they can raise their rents to recoup the expense.
And what about the other side?
The other side, they seem to be really well organized. They have a strong grassroots, campaign going right now. They've got some sympathetic council candidates at this point. Progressive Portland, which is a nonprofit social welfare organization, they recently came out and said that they're going to support rent control. And a lot of the stuff that they've been doing has been community organizing through email, but with the school bond, which will also be on the ballot, in one day they dropped $20,000 into the school bond campaign, which is, it's a large sum of money for this stage of the campaign. So if they're going to go in on the rent stabilization, you can expect to see the proponents of this, get some money out of it.
Are you seeing any commonality between supporters of the two housing referendums? I mean, are people who are for rent stabilization also for neighborhood say, or
I
the opposite?
I think you see overlap, especially on the peninsula. I mean, you got a lot of folks on Munjoy Hill and that India Street neighborhood area. That area is going gangbusters right now, and they're seeing 3 units get torn down, and they're getting these like sleek, maybe more dense developments, and they've been taking it on the chin in terms of development for quite a while now. So I've seen some overlap on the East End anyway.
That's interesting because it seems like the neighbors are never going to say we want the project to be bigger. We want more traffic, we want less parking. And so by definition, if you get the immediate neighbors involved, the project's always going to be smaller.
It's going to be an uphill fight,
and that's going to decrease the supply of housing, which is what makes one of the things that makes rents climb.
Well, and it's about keeping Portland the way it is, or the way that they saw it when they moved here.
Yeah.
Keeping the neighborhood character the same, keeping it as affordable as it was when they came, but things change.
Which is a moving target.
Right.
I mean, anybody who was here in the late 70s and early 80s
said, change it, please.
Looking at Munjoy Hill, saying, I'm not going up there. You going up there? So I mean, this is a constantly evolving thing. So I do find it interesting that people have this collective desire to preserve or reproduce the past when if you poll them, their definitions of the past vary widely depending on when they came.
Yeah. All right, cool. Thanks, Randy. I mean, we didn't even get to the school bond, so we'll have to have you back.
That's right.
We'll do that.
It'll be a whole half hour.
Cool.
Thanks, Randy.
Thanks. Okay, so Bill, the state government has been kind of quiet, except for the number of people running for governor. There's kind of a stampede.
I think we're up to a dozen almost.
I think so. I think that last I heard there was 9 Democrats,
one independent,
and at least 3 Republicans.
Right, there was Mary Mayhew
there's 2 Republicans and 1 coming. So let's go start with the Republicans. You got Mary Mayhew, who has been announced for quite a while and out raising money. Then we heard last week that Ken Fredette, the House Republican leader, has announced also.
Right. And Garrett Mason was about to announce when, unfortunately, his mother died suddenly, and he had to postpone that announcement. But yeah, it looks like it's going to be a very robust 3-way race for at least for the Republican nomination. And I think it's an interesting grouping because the impression up until now has certainly been that Governor LePage will back Mary Mayhew in her candidacy. Ken Fredette who has been perhaps LePage's, or not perhaps, definitely LePage's closest ally in the legislature, is now in that mix, and it's going to put LePage, I would assume, in a difficult position as he tries to decide which one he's going to back. And then overhanging all that, of course, is the still pending decision by Susan Collins as to whether she's going to jump in. So, everybody knew going into this primary season that the Democratic primary was going to be a free-for-all, which it is. But the Republican one is shaping up that way as well.
I don't
who doesn't
know
want to be governor?
Garrett Mason that well, but it seems like you'll have all three grouped on the right wing of the party.
Yeah. I think he's a little more in the libertarian direction. But yeah, they're all coming from essentially the same place. He's matured tremendously, over the past. I guess he's coming up on 8 years now, isn't he? Because he came in, if I recall, in 2010, and has availed himself pretty well in the legislature. But you're right; they're all in pretty much the same camp. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that divides and defines the Republican Party, assuming that Collins doesn't run.
Right.
If she does run, well, then it just works even further to her advantage because that vote will be splintered three ways now. And she will pick up that significant portion of the Republican Party that wants to move away from those politics. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. But
so
we'll know by the end of the month.
Yeah, we'll know. And it's interesting. I mean, is there really, what are the wings of the Republican Party that need to be brought together? Is there really that moderate wing that we've all become so familiar with over the years, but that doesn't seem to be expressing itself. I mean,
they've been quiet for so long.
Right.
Are they still there? That's a good question.
I mean, is there a place for Roger Cates?
Yeah, I think there is, and I think that what they have learned the hard way is that it does not work to their advantage, unfortunately, to engage in a war of words with the LePage wing of the party. Mm-hmm. It just further divides and roils things up. So they've been very quiet, although Roger Cates has occasionally stepped up and spoken his mind and his conscience. I think those people are still out there, and I think that if Susan Collins were to run, you would see those people suddenly reappearing in droves. Right now, I think the reason they've been so quiet is because what is there to make noise about? It's just been one, in their view, for a lot of them, one disappointment after another. So we'll see. If Collins doesn't run, then this is going to be a primary pretty much conducted by the LePage base of the party.
LePage base cage match.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Tag team.
A name I heard recently that I haven't, he hasn't announced yet, but one name that came up was Mike Thibodeau, the Senate president. And he's sort of an interesting person in this conversation because he's very conservative. He's not in any way what I would call a moderate, but he's personally very moderate. He has kind of a moderate approach. He was critical of the governor, went off the rails and left the obscene message on Drew Gattine's voicemail and at various other times he's stood up to the governor during the budget crisis. He worked out a compromise and stayed with it, and so it would be interesting to see how he would fare.
Yeah, it's what I find fascinating is if you go back 8 years to when these folks were all just getting their footing, it was widely assumed that Mike Thibodeau was going to be Paul LePage's wingman.
Yeah.
And everybody, just because of their political alignment, and everybody assumed that would be the case. And that Fredette would be kind of the thorn in LePage's side. And that's pretty much reversed now to where LePage and Thibodeau, depending on who you believe, rarely if ever speak. And Fredette, who locked horns with LePage early on about whether he should even run for the speakership, is now considered LePage's right-hand man in the legislature. So, yeah, these roles change. I think what Thibodeau has distinguished himself most for is being a conscientious guy, and not so much falling in lockstep every time behind or defending the indefensible things that come out of the governor's office. He's made it a point to stand up when the time is right and say, no, this is wrong. So I think that, speaks well of him. What it means in terms of his political future, it's hard to say. I'm not sure what he's going to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's interesting. He's been able to hold enough, I'm talking about Fredette, enough Republican members of the House together to sustain vetoes, which has been basically our system of government for the last 2 years, is
pass it, veto it, fail to override.
Yeah, by 2 votes, including 6 people who voted for it for enactment.
Yeah. Well, you do that over time, and it has. It really is the roadmap for so many issues up there. But you got to remember that every one of these things that has been passed, vetoed, and then not overridden has been at one point the will of the majority. And I really believe that if you keep doing that over and over and over again over a period of 2 gubernatorial terms, there's kind of a latent frustration that builds up. And that's why I think the 2018 election is going to be really interesting to see. It's going to be finally an opportunity for voters who are not behind Paul LePage to stand up and say, enough is enough. And my question is, how is that going to play out in terms of the vote? Will it be a Democrat? Will it be another Republican? I just feel like there's a lot of pressure that's built up over the last 8 years that we kind of see but don't see anymore because it's become so normal. And that could very well come uncorked next fall, a year from this fall.
Yeah, I just see a tremendous cynicism. And one of the things that LePage has been very successful at is kind of tearing down the other side, and tearing down not only the other side, but the process itself, the institutions. The legislature's untrustworthy. No, you can't believe anything anybody says. And I think it's hard to see anybody any of these names that we've seen so far kind of bring us back to a point where people would be like, well, I don't agree with him 100%, but I think I would go along with him or her.
I don't see anybody rising above that.
And so it's going to be another one of these really fractious years, I think.
Yeah. With the Democrats, on the other hand, their problem is much more pragmatic. Which one of us can, rather than run completely on ideology that might not be in step with the middle of Maine's electorate, which one of us is going to be electable? And that's going to be very interesting to see as Democrats from all directions run for this office.
Yeah. Well, speaking of fractious, something happened in Washington last week with the president and the Democrats that we haven't actually seen in Maine. Usually when President Trump does something, I think, oh, yeah, we saw LePage doing that 3 years ago.
Been there, done that.
But, the president went into a meeting and cut a deal with the Democratic leadership on a matter of controversy to his party. And it was about a 3-month debt ceiling limit and continuing resolution on the budget and some storm relief, which sounds like no big deal. It sounds like the thing that they normally should be able to do before they tie their shoes in the morning. But it was a big deal because it's been so politicized in the past. And what's your take? Do you think something different's
happening here? I felt like I was
here?
Watching another episode of The Apprentice.
Yeah,
I really did, because wasn't a regular watcher, but I always did notice his tendency to first align himself with one or another, or maybe a small group of contestants in that show, and then quite dramatically at the last minute pull the rug out from under them. It's classic Donald Trump. And perhaps the most lasting image I'll have of this past month in national politics is that ear-to-ear grin on the face of Chuck Schumer, sitting in the White House, not quite believing what he was hearing. So I think it just goes to how transactional Donald Trump is and how his roots in terms of one political ideology or another run no deeper than a parking lot. And he's doing what he does. How long this will last, obviously Democrats are saying, well, maybe this could be the beginning of a pattern. I wouldn't count on it, right. But I think that he's clearly thrown a monkey wrench and further enraged the Republicans on Capitol Hill, no question about it.
Yeah. I've been reading some stuff by Republicans, and there was a piece in the Daily Standard or the Weekly Standard by Fred Barnes about why traditional Reaganite Republican conservatives have to stick with Trump. And his argument was, we don't like him, but we're never going to have a situation where we've got the House and the Senate and the presidency all in one column. And there's a lot of things, times when he's going to embarrass us, and he is going to be counterproductive, and he is going to shoot himself in the foot, but we can't help the Democrats marginalize him. And basically he was telling members of Congress to just suck it up and follow in line, because the things that they really care about can't happen without a person in the White House, without a Republican in the White House. And the things that they really care about are not health care, and it's not really the debt ceiling. That's the far right. It's what they care about is reform.
Taxation, right?
Yeah. So they want to lower tax rates and cut corporate tax rates, and that is never going to happen unless they can, unless they can keep this alignment.
Well, it's interesting because that's probably the one issue in which they are aligned. I mean, which you can look at Trump and say, yes, that's, he comes from that camp, right, too. One of the dangerous assumption when you look at the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and everybody's saying, how can we be stuck in neutral with all this? It is that it assumes that Trump is a typical Republican, and he's not. He never will be. I don't think he'll ever be a typical anything when it comes to partisan politics. And as a result, I think it's going to evolve on kind of an issue-by-issue basis. Mm-hmm. Healthcare was a disaster.
Right.
And, there is still there's still some speculation that Congress might go it alone with the governors on healthcare and pass some kind of whatever you want to call it, reform, repair to Obamacare. And they'll do it without Trump, almost in spite of him. But tax reform, taxation is something that's near and dear to this guy. So I think Barnes might have a point. I mean, if you can't get the kind of tax reform they're looking for with this president, guy who came, straight from the gilded towers of Gotham City, you're not going to get it done. The problem is, can you keep his attention span that long, and can you keep his loyalty that long? So far, he's demonstrated that you can't do that.
Well, they've gotten their Supreme Court justice that they wanted.
Yes, that's about the only thing they did.
And I guess it's still in play that they could get a tax reform. And so as long as their agenda is still a possibility, you're not going to see a massive defection. But I think the thing that could cause a massive defection is if they think they're going to lose the House.
Right. And that's where some of the social issues come into play.
Yeah.
And that's why DACA and I just read today that they're back in court again trying to roll back the restrictions on the immigration, the ban.
Yeah.
Whenever he does that, not in all the red meat Republican districts, but there are Republican districts where that kind of thing, DACA in particular, seems to really have resonated. That's not helpful to a lot of these Republicans who are already kind of walking that tightrope, trying to secure another term. So that's where he loses them, and that's where they have no choice. But particularly when he gets real outrageous, they have no choice but to speak out against him. And then he reacts to that because he doesn't like to be publicly disrespected that way. And all of a sudden it all starts to fall apart again. So it's not on the the overarching issue of tax reform, I think that they're all going to fracture. It's over these other not smaller, but different kind of issues that leave these Republicans with no place to run and no place to hide.
So I wonder if Maine's 2nd District is a district where how these issues play out there. Bruce Poliquin has pursued a strategy of not talking to anybody.
Because he knows he won't get reelected.
Right, we said that. It's
right,
very clear
right.
about that. It'll cost him the election. So it'll be interesting to see what the election will end up being about. If it is about the Mexican border or if it's going to be about something closer to home.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he needs to what the Democrats need in the 2nd District is a real strong candidate who can relentlessly chase Bruce Poliquin around that district and hold him to account for a lot of the things that he's said recently and a lot of his actions before now, because he has really managed to dodge a lot of flack. And you would think going into an election that he shouldn't be able to do that, but so far so good.
Well, it's going to be tough. It's a big district, so you're going to have to try to really chase
That's
hard.
right. A lot of miles.
All right. Well, thanks, Bill.
Sure.
And we'll get together next week.
This is a Press Herald podcast. You can hear past episodes at pressherald.com/podcasts. You can subscribe on iTunes, on Android devices, and stream on Stitcher. Please email comments and questions to letterstotheeditor@pressherald.com. Thank you for listening.